Of the doctors who bought into the alternative COVID treatment trend in the first year of the pandemic, Dr. Pierre Korry was probably the one with the most credentials to talk about medical intervention, but that isn't saying a lot. Korry is a pulmonologist. His specialty is medical treatment of the respiratory system. COVID is a respiratory disease. As the virus was causing intensive care units across the country to fill up in April of 2020, Korry teamed with other medical professionals, notably fellow pulmonary doctor Paul Merrick, to found Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance. Shortened to FLCCC, this group immediately jumped on every potential treatment for COVID and promoted each heavily until they landed on Ivermectin. I've mentioned the anti-parasitic drug in both previous episodes on COVID-19 scammers, but Korry and FLCCC really, really loved ivermectin. After glomming on to this drug in October of 2020, Korry became the face of ivermectin advocacy. He appeared on Joe Rogan's show, he testified to a Senate committee in December of that year, gave speeches, got on TV, wrote articles, and eventually issued a study of the efficacy of using a dewormer to treat or even prevent a virus. Eventually, his endless promotion of ivermectin, as well as a cocktail of other drugs, would catch up with him. But like with other COVID scammers, the damage was already done. Welcome to True Grift Episode 4, COVID Scammers Part 3. In the previous two episodes, we've discussed fake testing sites, fake COVID cures, and a group dedicated to just pretending the virus wasn't dangerous by promoting the latter. Today, we're going to be looking at a guy I think is one of the most impactful COVID scammers with Dr. Pierre Korry. Dr. Korry went from unknown outside the very fringes to a national figure with his December 8th, 2020 testimony to the U.S. Senate Homeland Security Committee, where he advocated for the deployment of what was then being called, or I guess it still is called this, the Math Plus protocol that Korry and FLCCC had developed. This treatment regimen was dependent on the stage of the COVID infection, where earlier stages included like antiviral prescription drugs that just were off the shelf, and later stages found more of a focus on anti-inflammatories in order to ease the, quote, cytokine storm, unquote. That, just going to back up a second, that was more of a thing for the 1918 Spanish flu. That was what caused a lot of young people to die, is because their immune systems would react heavily to that. Or at least that's kind of the prevailing theory on why that happened. I don't think anyone's actually proven that that's a thing, but it's always been kind of the assumed reality. There doesn't seem to be anything like that with COVID-19. Now, after those anti-inflammatories, there were anticoagulants, like corticosteroids. Oh boy, I'm going to have so many. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. Corticosteroids, these are certain words that are going to be pretty complex compound words that I have been reading the script and writing the script for 3 days, and I got to tell you, I'm still going to screw up words. So bear with me here. So after the steroids, there's a series of vitamins, specifically C and B1. Keep those in mind for later. Ivermectin, of course, was included and was said to be effective even before an infection, so prophylactic. One of the things that I have found fascinating while reviewing the COVID scammer statements is that I think a lot of these people were generally trying to find a low-cost, effective solution for people. It's not that they deny the existence of COVID like your uncle who refused to wear a mask did. It's that they believe that there were already solutions on the market that were cheap and effective. In his testimony to the Senate committee, Korry made the point that drugs like remdesivir and therapies like monoclonal antibodies were experimental and expensive. But his treatment options are all cheap, off-the-shelf drugs that you could potentially prevent COVID from even taking hold in someone's body. If Korry or America's frontline doctors from last episode were correct, they would save millions of lives the world over for practically nothing. In the first episode of the series, I mentioned the preprint study that first gave some hope that ivermectin was an effective COVID treatment. and that it was retracted due to irregularities. This actually happens somewhat frequently. Fouled data suggests one conclusion, and the media seizes on it as fact before other experts can replicate the results. Every couple of years, there's a study that gets media attention for an afternoon that red wine or chocolate are good for you, actually. What you don't tend to hear is that a few months later, that study gets retracted because the data was off and the results weren't repeatable. Sometimes you have on the surface irregularities too. Giving everyone the same dose of something no matter the difference in sex or body weight, not factoring in for other drugs they're taking, not accounting for diet or exercise levels. This all matters, and often these things aren't controlled for. When other experts tear through reports and see these issues, or can't replicate the study, the paper gets pulled and new studies get kicked off to attempt to correct for the mistakes of the previous one. During the pandemic, Judy Mikovits became a household name for people who took the digital soldier oath and other weirdos. She participated in the documentary called Plandemic. It's being generous, where she made a series of wild and just untrue claims. Mikovits was one of these people who willingly produced a bad study to boost her career and has had a victim complex ever since then. The history goes beyond the scope of this video, but she was hired to be a lead researcher at a private institute studying, myalgic encephalomitis. There we go. I found conflicting statements that this is both and also is not the same thing as chronic fatigue syndrome. So we're just going to stick with the scientific name, and I'm never going to repeat it again. In 2009, she released a paper claiming that xenotropic murine leukemia virus, related virus, which may be associated with the disease she was studying. I'm not saying that again, by the way, and the virus-related virus thing is just driving me up the wall. Anyways, this was retracted from the magazine Science in 2011 after other experts studied her methodology and found she had manipulated data and amplified just 2 likely compromised samples so much that they appeared to be most of the data. There was a lot of legal fallout after that I'm just not going to get into. But even Mikovits ran a new study in 2012 that found no link between the virus and the disease. Why divert into other scientists for so long here? Well, Korry and the FLCCC based a lot of their ivermectin support on that withdrawn paper I mentioned earlier. But once it was withdrawn, they needed to prove that no, actually, ivermectin was cool and good and is our best friend when it comes to fighting COVID. FLCCC conducted a study. They manipulated the data so that the good results looked better, and the bad results were all for people who didn't get their recommended treatment. Simple as that. The study was released in 2021 and retracted by the Journal of Intensive Care Medicine the same year due to irregularities in the data, as you can imagine. If you're going to claim your pet treatment saves lives, it turns out fudging the numbers to prove that is going to get scrutinized. Later studies and other meta-studies would show no benefits to ivermectin use on COVID patients. I think this is the point where I have to step in editorially and ask the viewer something. Do you believe the one renegade study or the overwhelming data showing them to be wrong? The reason I'm positing this question is because there's an anecdote that gets passed around every time there's a small group of people pushing one idea against an entire scientific community who stonewall them at every turn. It's Alfred Wegener and the concept of continental drift. For most of human history, there was no way to observe or conceive of the planet's outlay of land masses having been in any different formation than they are today. Wegener suggested in 1915 that land masses sat on a series of underlying plates that shifted over time, forming both mountains and rifts along with the current arrangement of continents. It's kind of insane that 110 years ago, we didn't fully understand earthquakes and how they were caused, but yeah, the technology and theory took a long time to develop, and the scientific community largely rejected Wegener's proposals. This has become a rallying point for a lot of fringe beliefs. They point to Wegener's struggles and they say, hey, his fellow geologists push back on him, and they associate their rejection of mainstream scientific thought with his. Ironically, a lot of these people who analyze their situation and compare it to Wegener's are actually probably closer to Charles Darwin and evolution. And they don't actually believe in evolution in a lot of cases here. So the early debates around that whole thing would be a lot better and more famous comparisons. So whatever, it's fine. They like to use this one because it seems, creationism is a little bit more jiving with that. The point of this secondary sidetrack from the topic at hand is that, yes, there are cases where one person or a group puts forward a theory or makes a discovery and gets called charlatans or quacks while spending years fighting the current orthodoxy. It's an unfortunate feature of science and, let's be frank, society in general. This tendency has been used by fringe theorists for literal centuries now to push their ideas. This happened frequently during COVID. One person or study would emerge, and the next day people are throwing off their masks to drink bleach or issuing ivermectin to the population of a prison to keep the inmates from getting or spreading COVID. That happened, by the way. That was a thing. I swear. Okay. No more getting off topic. Okay. No, sorry. We got to talk about Korry's partner in literal crime, Dr. Paul Marik. Formerly a respected Virginia-based doctor, Marik would end up leaving his job after a series of events that started with him being reprimanded by that state's medical board for prescribing medication to people who were not his patients. And I can't even get a re-up on my Synthroid without having to see a doctor at least once a year. I've been taking it for almost 20 years. It's not like my thyroid is going to fix itself all of a sudden. Just let me get my fucking Synthroid. It costs nothing. What are we worried about? Okay, so this guy is, I can't get my medication that I literally need. But this guy is out there handing out tramadol and oxycodone to randos. This is amazing stuff. How did he not lose his license for that alone? I can't explain just how much regard this guy had in the medical community up to COVID. It was a real life comes at you fast period of about 3 years where he just destroyed his reputation. He started rolling that stone, the one that would eventually crush him, in 2017 when he published a paper on the use of hydrocortisone, vitamin C, and vitamin B1. This should sound familiar if you were listening earlier and taking notes, as a way to treat sepsis. Known as the HAT protocol, it was the basis of the Math Plus protocol that the FLCCC proposed for treating COVID, just minus the ivermectin. From the start, researchers were skeptical of just how viable this treatment was. By 2021, enough studies were completed to find that, yes, Marik's study was flawed, and there was no evidence that the program he created was viable. He lost his board certification in 2023 due to his ivermectin claims, and now promotes himself as a, quote, status quo destabilizer. The point here is that I had to guess Marik came up with the Math Plus protocol that FLCCC promoted and likely led the studies the group did to prove that it worked. Despite having every study he co-authored on ivermectin retracted or rejected, Dr. Korry persisted in trying to promote it as a miracle cure. A lot of the time when you come across a grifter like this, they know that their claims are bullshit. Uri Geller, the future subject of this series, knows he doesn't have telekinetic abilities. The snake oil salesman of yesteryear knew that the tonics they peddled as panaceas were hokum. Guys wandering around New Mexico selling gold and oil detectors that they claimed were from a downed UFO knew they cobbled them things together in their garage. Korry is not one of these people. He really does think that ivermectin prevents or cures COVID. In his many podcast appearances, he states he's been taking it since before his October 2020 revelation. He's taken it on camera a couple of times. He wrote a book about it using his his personal experiences as examples of how great it is. The guy loved ivermectin. That's what makes what happened in November of 2021 so goddamn funny. Pierre Korry got COVID. He'd spent a year at this point touting the positive effects of ivermectin, so he did the logical thing and admitted that ivermectin doesn't prevent COVID after all, and went on to get a vaccine, and, to this day, he's just one of the... No, that's fucking... Of course he didn't do that. Korry doubled the fuck down. That's what you do. He blamed his infection on the Delta variant having a higher, quote, sorry, I have to put this in quotes, quote, heavier viral load, unquote, that somehow overwhelmed his daily ivermectin injections. Now, not a doctor or anything, but this is the same guy who has been claiming that ivermectin cures COVID, and so I have to imagine that a full-blown infection would have a heavier viral load than whatever caused his initial sickness, unless he dove into a vat of pure COVID or something, an ill-advised publicity stunt, which I don't think is what happened here. What did happen was that after he recovered, he claimed ivermectin kept him from getting deathly ill. Good enough that you recover, not strong enough to stop you from getting infected. This is some magical thinking. By the time this happened, Korry and the FLCCC had already started losing some momentum. Vaccines were available for months and had proven to be safe and effective. Their market was shrinking day by day as people found that they wanted to go back to restaurants, theaters, and stadiums, and the other public places that had shuttered during COVID, and were now enforcing some form of vaccine card checks, or at least asking people to be vaccinated. The conspiracy community, already wary of the vaccines, were not happy about the cards, of course, claiming that they would be locking people into camps if they didn't take the shot. Korry and his friends were slinging horse medication to QAnon people at a furious rate, but the grift was going to be coming to an end soon. As soon as we hit herd immunity in the U.S., which we never did because too many people rejected the vaccines, the FLCCC was just going to be toast. So it would, of course, come out against the COVID vaccine by the end of 2021. When I sat down to start writing this script, as a matter of fact, Pierre Korry's latest tweet was him coming out against all vaccines, which was probably where this was going to go anyways. We'll have to pay attention and watch this closer in the future, but I'm getting the feeling that this is Korry signaling his intention to go into the holistic medicine grift. Now, holistic medicine is often used by an umbrella, is like a kind of an umbrella term, right? Mostly by medical grifters these days. Chiropractic practitioners, for example, will claim to be part of that community, or that their specific treatment is a slice of holistic medical science. It's not, but there's no board that's going to tell them to stop saying that. I'm sure in a year or so, Korry is going to be promoting some cocktail of drugs or whatever treatment program that he comes up with that will make you healthier some way. Likely with a caveat that you need to combine it with a healthy diet and moderate exercise, and he's going to call it holistic medicine. So, I've spent 18 minutes so far explaining all the ways Pierre Korry loves ivermectin and how it isn't useful for COVID, but I've never fully explained why I call him a scammer instead of just a weird guy. Let's talk about Leading Edge Clinic. You wouldn't know about this place because it more or less doesn't exist. You can find it easily enough by going to drpierrekorry.com. It takes you to a website that has, like a veterinarian in 2006 would have this website. And it has a banner populated exclusively by people who appear to be in a weird sex cult. This is where Korry, and please note that this is in quotes, practices medicine. Now, Korry's deluxe treatment options for both long-haul COVID and, again, in quotes, vaccine injury consist of 3 virtual visits with either Korry or a nurse practitioner working for the, quotes around this word too, clinic. After the first call, the employee will come up with a treatment plan and then check in twice more over the next 4 months. Cost? Well, if you get the nurse practitioner, who is not the other partner, for some reason, he also costs as much as Dr. Korry, but we'll get there. Actually, we won't. I don't talk about him at all. He's just a nurse practitioner. If you get the nurse practitioner that isn't the other partner in the business, it's going to cost you $1,950. Korry, or his partner, will set you back $2,350. If you don't have that, but you still want some COVID care, Leading Edge can still help you out. If you have, say, $300, they'll send you medication after a 30-minute consult. If you have actual COVID, they'll charge you $400 for 30 minutes. And they will also give you a 15-minute follow-up. So I guess they're, hey, that extra $100 is going a long way. And that's, most likely to instruct you on how to take ivermectin. All this to get a prescription for a drug that won't treat COVID or your, quotes around these words, vaccine injuries. Korry isn't the only one doing this, by the way. It's the same business model as the telemedicine service that America's frontline doctors worked with in the previous episode. Even after COVID became an afterthought for much of the country, people were still finding sources for ivermectin online that were somehow less reputable than Korry and his firm. There's even reports of fake ivermectin going around, counterfeit ivermectin. So that's scary. I can't explain how insidious what Korry and the FLCCC pushed was and continues to be. I've said it before, but there's nothing wrong with wanting to find a cheap, effective solution to a complex medical problem like COVID. But ivermectin wasn't it. In 2021, the number of people who called about ivermectin overdoses was 4 times what it had been in 2019. Prescriptions for the drug were topping 80,000. 80,000 in a month, when 3,000 had been the average in previous years. People were desperate to stave off COVID, and having both doctors and government officials like Senator Ron Johnson constantly berating social distancing, masks, and vaccines while praising unproven treatments like ivermectin and the FLCCC Math Plus protocol, it wasn't a good mix. Once the mainstream science community started pushing back on Korry's dangerous claims, he became a hero amongst the weirdest guys in the country. Both Alex Jones and Brett Weinstein, who's one of the intellectual dark web guys if you aren't aware of him, they took ivermectin on air to prove their dedication to not complying with the current medical science. Joe Rogan had Korry on the most downloaded podcast in the country when he was at his powers. And this guy just spun made up ivermectin benefits to one of the dumbest men on the planet with no pushback. Rogan would incorporate it into his own COVID treatment plan that would then filter down to lesser weirdos like Tim Pool. Aaron Rodgers, a man who is now more CTE than human based on the last couple of years, endorsed Rogan's plan when he got COVID. These celebrities and entertainers promoting insane non-treatments in the middle of a pandemic matters. Despite the lack of authority on medical topics these people had, there were still large swaths of the population that were more than willing to listen to what they had to say and follow their lead. Korry and the FLCCC's promotion of ivermectin killed people, flat out. No mincing words. People died because instead of listening to the mainstream medical community, they listened to a series of grifters and morons, in part because they weren't the mainstream medical. Yeah, I was really bringing that in for a landing there. Mainstream medical community. I'm not cutting that out. So that's going to do it for the COVID Scammer series for now. Initially, this was going to be a multi-subject episode. And then every time I looked for something else or went to look at Dr. Pierre Korry and what he's up to and what FLCCC's done, I was bumping up against more and more stuff, and I could not justify jamming additional subjects into this episode. There's just so much. The COVID scams go deep and they go hard. Fake vaccine sites. The current Surgeon General in the state of Florida was one of the guys who was on the steps of the Supreme Court with America's frontline doctors on that first day. Like, there are people who were out there just doing the weirdest things. The PPP loans, we could talk about that if we wanted to, and how a bunch of those were technically grants, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the federal government stealing medical supplies from states as things arrived and then redistributing it at a cost. There's so much stuff. This episode, this whole series, doing a little bit of a retrospective here because I have about 5 more minutes before I really want to end this, so we get a nice 30-minute episode. But the kind of initial conception of this, the initial conception of this series, the COVID series, was actually going to be one episode where I pretty much just talked about the theft of medical supplies by the federal government from states, and the anecdote of the state of Massachusetts using the New England Patriots team plane to get their supplies in, because the federal government had seized I think they'd seized something like 10,000 masks from the state of Maryland like a week before. There were states that were quite literally trying to hide the fact that they had stuff coming in from the government because the administration was just taking stuff and then selling it to the highest bidder. And it's just, what is that? And we can talk about Elon Musk saying he was going to build a bunch of respirators and then he never did. There's just so much with COVID. It goes on, and I think whether you happen to be anti-vax or whatever, I think we can all kind of look at it and say, yeah, it was kind of a mess on a lot of fronts. It's not like the main corporations behind the vaccines or any of the treatment methodologies or, the healthcare industry as a whole, they're not angels, as my wife's grandmother would like to say about anyone who gets shot by the cops. It's just that they were somehow, for the first time in history, a little bit better than the opposition. That's an odd moment to experience. So we'll get back to COVID stuff. Probably not for a while. Going forward, I want to do a couple of these more serious episodes and then something a little bit more lighthearted and fun. And I do have a target picked out and started doing the first bits of research. The thing about this whole series is that every subject is going to steer into some dark territory on every single episode. It kind of comes with I said territory, I'm going to say territory again. I'm not going off a script right now. It sort of is just par for the course when you talk about scammers, because there's always victims. And that means that there are people who are separated from money, loved ones, life, and there are people who are going to suffer. And very, very few cases end with the grifters themselves actually seeing consequences. I would like to get to a few of those, and I do have some that are planned down the way. But there's also cases where the victims are also in on the con, and they get punished for it. And I am really going to touch on some of those. But that's still not in the near future. There's a lot more stuff to talk about. So next time, the #resistance grifters. See you then.